But welcome everybody. This is the third ACFID Universities Linkage Conference. Needless to say, we're incredibly pleased for such a large turnout, and it seems that participatory development is well and truly alive and well. And particularly, I'd like to welcome our international guests who have come a long way, and perhaps in particular the New Zealanders who have foregone or escaped the latest Peter Jackson cinema extravaganza tomorrow. But I'd also like to ask that we acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and whose cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history. I would also like to thank our sponsors who are listed on the cover of the program, but in particular I'd like to thank our major sponsor, Plan Australia, who brought Dr. Alan Fowler here, as well as contributed generously to the cost of the conference. I'd also like to thank the ANU Gender Institute, who brought Professor Geeta Sen here. Deakin University also generously contributed to Professor Robert Chambers' visit. ACFID and the ANU School of Archaeology and Anthropology, that's where I'm based, for their generous support in both financial and staff time. I would also like to thank AusAid, who support the Linkages network and who have sponsored nearly 200 of AusAid scholars to come, as well as a large number of AusAid staff. So thank you, AusAid. Now, to open the conference, I'd like to call on the Chancellor of the Australian National University, Gareth Evans, but before I do, let me do some introduction. Gareth Evans has an outstanding career in public life. I use the word present tense very deliberately because if you looked at the newspaper this morning and listened to the news, he had no small role in Australia's vote or abstention on the whole Palestinian issue in the United Nations. He's a graduate of Melbourne and Oxford universities and has been active in the social justice policy field for most of his career. He was influential in drafting the Racial Discrimination Act in 1975 and was a founding member of the Law Reform Commission. He joined Federal Parliament in 1978 and served in government as Attorney General as well as other ministerial positions until he became Foreign Minister from 1988 to 96, one of our longest serving Foreign Ministers. Gareth's most widely acknowledged successes as Foreign Minister were his initiation and role in the UN Peace Plan for Cambodia. In addition, as Leader of the Senate, he steered the native title legislation in Australia, the groundbreaking native title legislation in Australia, through a divided Senate. Following his career in politics, he became President and Executive Director of the International Crisis Group, where he was responsible for its rapid expansion and the outstanding reputation it has today. Gareth Evans is presently co-chair of the Global Centre for Responsibility to Protect, chair of the International Advisory Board Centre for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and convener of the Australian Pacific Leadership Network and Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. And he's an ideal person to open this conference because he brings together activism, academe, and NGO work together. But personally, I would like to recall our Chancellor's role in a much smaller incident when we first met in 1988. There was a rowdy demonstration outside the apartheid South African embassy, well attended by the police and the media, and perhaps less so by demonstrators themselves. A young woman jumped the fence and proceeded to kick at the window of the embassy before the police could apprehend her. A South African diplomat appeared with a broomstick and started hitting her. Janet Hunt, who is here today, and I were appalled at that very undiplomatic behaviour, and immediately Janet said, "Let's see Gareth." And so we jumped into our old car and went down to the then old Parliament House, which was where the Parliament was sitting, and after calling his office, Gareth appeared, came down the stairs and chatted very briefly and correctly pointed out that it was actually not his portfolio area and there's very little he could do. The next morning the diplomat was expelled. I think you had some say in that decision. Ladies and gentlemen, Gareth Evans, our Chancellor.
Well, thank you, Patrick, for that very warm and generous introduction, and what an exhilarating experience it is to walk into a conference like this, not just full, as I was saying to Robert Chambers a moment ago, of the old greybeards like him and me, but obviously a really vibrant and excited and committed group of younger people, as well as a real cross-section of academics and activists. I should say that my engagement in the anti-apartheid enterprise goes back a very long way indeed, including the first occasion I ever found myself in police custody, which first and last occasion was in 1964, when I was president of the student body at Melbourne University, and we had one of those visiting Springbok rugby teams coming to Australia, and I led, back in the days when they got off planes out on the tarmac and walked across a couple of 100 metres, and I had a group of other demonstrators with me, all dressed up in rugby clothes, with black faces. I'm sorry, this is a bit politically incorrect these days, but black faces holding up signs saying, "Why won't you play with us?" And careered out onto the tarmac, jumped over the fence to accost these hulking rugby players. Mercifully, the police intervened before we... But that's when I had not only my first arrest, but my first headlock. And it's not an experience I particularly want to repeat. I turned to political activism of a more moderate kind thereafter, but the fire still burned for many years, as you know. Well, look, I don't think anyone's ever accused me of being very much influenced by Karl Marx, even in the hairiest days of my youth. But I do confess to a very long-standing empathy with that famous line of his that the philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. And I'm delighted to have been invited to open this conference because it is committed, you are committed to changing the world, to improving the way, dramatically improving the way in which we respond to one of the great moral imperatives of our time, the eradication of extreme poverty, wherever in the world that continues to exist. And also because this conference is dedicated to directly involving the philosophers, in other words, the university research community in that process. I hardly need to explain to this audience the nature and extent of the imperative to make poverty history. If we ignore the pain and distress of our fellow human beings, whether it's in failing to respond to mass atrocity crimes, or failing in our responsibility to give succour to those fleeing persecution as refugees, or failing to act against human trafficking, or failing to contribute a significant share of our national income to humanitarian relief and to well-targeted development assistance, if we fail to do any of these things, we simply diminish our common humanity. Governments should act on these issues, not just because our own narrow economic or security national interests might be directly or indirectly advanced now or in the future, but they should act simply because it's the right thing to do. Nor do I think I need to emphasise to this audience that the role and responsibilities of universities extend not only to teaching and traditional research, but to engaging as well, comprehensively, with the wider world and making a significant contribution to policy thinking, policy development. This is an issue about which I've been actually quite passionate as Chancellor of this university. And I certainly hope and expect that with the creation of the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy, as we've renamed it, and the associated network of public policy fellows that we're establishing in relevant disciplines right across the campus, we will be achieving, as Australia's national university, based in the national capital, close to national policy makers, a whole new level of vitality and value added in our policy-related output in the years ahead. So the ANU is partnering with the Australian Council for International Development in this conference, which is designed, of course, to advance the objectives of the ACFID University Linkages network, namely to enhance collaboration between Australian universities and Australian NGOs to undertake research for, rather than just about, international development. ACFID, and in its earlier incarnation as ACFOA, the Australian Council for Overseas Aid, has been around now long enough, for nearly 5 decades, for not even me to have been present at the creation. Its aim at the outset was to unite Australian NGOs concerned with global poverty and delivering overseas aid and development. And the Council's mission was to reduce inequity with and between nations and to champion the human rights of the poorest in the world. Now, nearly half a century later, the features of the Council's founding vision and purpose remain absolutely true. The achievement of a world where gross inequality within societies and between nations is reversed and extreme poverty is eradicated, where human development is ecologically and socially sustainable for the benefit of current and future generations, and where governments lead their societies in striving to protect and realise all people's human rights. This vision will be achieved through the collective efforts of civil society, governments, business, and all peoples who are concerned with the futures of our collective humanity. ACFID has pledged to find different and more effective means of drawing on a wide diversity of organisations and individuals for its research and policy analysis capability in order to inform the development of robust policy and practice in the theatre of international aid development. Thus, the development of this University Linkages network, which is driven by the belief that quality research is essential for good international development practice and policy development. It aspires to develop partnerships and processes that will make a positive difference in the lives of people who are living in poverty on the guiding principle, and this is critical to this conference next day or so, the guiding principles that quality research is sensitive to the issue being investigated, respectful of and beneficial to those who participate in the research and to the sector. More specifically, the aims of the network are to help shape the larger agenda around research related to international development, to ensure that research is both ethical and efficient and driven by our partners, to strengthen the existing commitment to maintaining and building new partnerships between NGOs and academics, as well as with overseas development partners and governments, and to improve the relationship between research training and teaching and learning in development. The ANU is a core member of this network, and we agree absolutely with those goals. It remains for me simply to welcome a number of people, to welcome to this conference today, for a start, our partners in this endeavour from the network. There's the ACFID members, all represented here, from Plan International Australia, from World Vision Australia, from International Women's Development Agency, the Fred Hollows Foundation, Save the Children Australia, Child Fund Australia, and Care Australia. And from the universities, part of the network, from La Trobe University, UTS, University of Technology in Sydney, University of New South Wales, University of Canberra, Deakin University, and the University of Melbourne. I also welcome, as did Patrick in opening, the support and participation of AusAid and its ongoing support of the ACFID University Network. I acknowledge the presence of Margaret McKinnon, who's First Assistant Director General, and we look forward, I understand, to an address later in the conference by Michael Carnahan, AusAid's Chief Economist, and to, even better, a reception hosted by Deputy Director General James Batley. I want to extend a special and a particularly warm welcome to our keynote speakers, Professor Robert Chambers from the UK, Professor Geeta Sen from India, Emily Dwi Tutaraga from Fiji, and Alan Fowler from South Africa. Professor Robert Chambers, you are an inspiring figure in the world of international development, often described as the guru's guru. The Institute of Development Studies describes you and your work as having always stood things on their head, putting the last first, focusing on relationships, redefining empowerment, developing participatory methods, and relentlessly focusing on power. You changed the way we think and do development work. Your ethos is that development is about people. And this conference, I guess, stands as a kind of festschrift to your career, and on behalf of everyone here present, I salute you. Professor Geeta Sen is another pioneer in the field of gender and development. Your research and policy advocacy on universal health care, the equity dimensions of health, the gender dimension of population policies, have made a huge impact on the way in which we think about policy making and gender equality, and we welcome you to Australia. Alan and Emily have been very much more regular visitors to Australia, ongoing partners with ACFID and its members, and we warmly welcome the both of you back. I extend a further special welcome to those participants here today who come from all over the world and are holders of Australian Leadership Awards and Australian Development Scholarships. How in the hell could we discuss participatory development without you? Welcome to Canberra. And finally, I want to acknowledge the School of Archaeology and Anthropology in the ANU College of Arts and Social Sciences, and the excellent work of Dr. Patrick Kilby and his whole team in bringing this conference together today. The 470 conference participants gathered here today are, as we can see just looking around, a very diverse group of academics, of students, of practitioners, government officials, and policy analysts. What we all have in common is our intense commitment to the linkage between good ideas, evidence, and changing practice on the ground. And what we all care intensely about is eradicating extreme poverty, which remains one of the supreme challenges of our times. I know you will make a major contribution to meeting that challenge in the deliberations which lie ahead. I wish you every possible success in that process and have a great deal of pleasure in declaring this conference open. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth, for that excellent opening. And I should say that tomorrow when the University Co-op Bookshop arrive, they have 5 signed copies of his book, The Responsibility to Protect. So keep that in mind. I'd like to now call on Mark Purcell, the Executive Director of ACFID, to chair the next session. Mark.
Thanks, Patrick, and thank you, Gareth. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting upon today, their elders, past and present, and also acknowledge any Indigenous delegates here in the conference today too, and welcome. I'm very, very delighted to introduce you to our first keynote speaker. With a warm-up like that from Gareth, it's really just to fan the flames a bit more for Robert. He is Professor Robert Chambers. He's a Fellow of the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. He has written groundbreaking books that have really guided our sector and the professionalisation of the international development community over the last few decades. He's written books like Rural Development, Putting the Last First, and Whose Reality Counts, Putting the First Last. His latest book is Provocations for Development and was published just this year, and hopefully it's also available in the ANU bookstore. If you haven't read his books, then you will definitely realise many of the concepts that he has put forward and developed over the years, because they've become core principles or ideas in the development discourse. Ideas such as vulnerability, multidimensional poverty, sustainable livelihoods, people-led development, bottom-up versus top-down, and giving people a voice. And so he really has been a leader and a guru for people working to tackle poverty over the last 40 years. His concept of participation has led to fundamental changes in development practice and will be familiar to most of you. And it informs how we go about our research, our monitoring and evaluation, and also our professional development in the 21st century. He acknowledges the importance of getting things wrong, that we make mistakes, that it's inevitable working in complex, often chaotic environments, in some cases where there is humanitarian situations. And we need to take those failures and learn from them and embrace them. So this conference will be going into both what is working, but will also, I hope, look at what hasn't worked, and let's learn from that experience. Participation, of course, is not a stagnant concept. It is incredibly core to what we do, and for those of you that might have seen Foreign Correspondent last night, which featured the ongoing plight of people in Cambodia who have been forced off their land in the pursuit of economic speculation with land, it is clear that people's rights, but also a fundamental approach of participation has been missing. Robert acknowledges that the conditions, the awareness, the priorities and aspirations of poor people are changing as the world changes, and in this conference we'll also be looking at the changing nature of economic and social development and their interaction. In his latest book, Robert asks, what would it take to eliminate poverty in the world? And in asking this question, he's following a grand tradition of the philosophers, going back to Aristotle and Socrates, which is asking really what sort of society do we want to make? What is the role of us as individuals in creating a good society? And so it's with great pleasure that I introduce Robert Chambers. Thank you.
Thank you for embarrassing me. There's a terrible amount of over-attribution to me. The reality is that I've been at the Institute of Development Studies for about 40 years, and my survival strategy was to write a book every 5 years. We had a 5-year interval for reappointment. And if you timed it right, none of your colleagues would ever read the book, but they would feel that they had to give you the benefit of the doubt. Also, my wife Jenny has been responsible for a lot of these ideas, and I have to pay tribute to her. I've been trying to persuade her for the last 30 years that we should write a book together, but she said she had noticed my collaborations in writing with other people and what a disaster they were, and she didn't want to destroy what little remained of a once beautiful relationship. So she hasn't been properly acknowledged. I would like to start by congratulating you on this conference. There's been no equivalent in the UK. I don't think there's been any equivalent anywhere in the world of a conference of this size with this range of papers. There are 82 of them, and I know there were more, 82 of them, which are all focusing on the subject of participation one way or another, participatory research and other aspects of participation. There's no equivalent in the UK. So I really would congratulate you on a first, and I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking those who've been responsible for bringing us all together. Now this is of course people in ACFID and people in ANU, but I would particularly like to mention Megan Cooper, Nikki Wright, who've done a tremendous amount in support, and Patrick Kilby, without whom this wouldn't have happened. So thank you. I originally wanted to call this a thrilling time to be alive, and then I thought that wasn't perhaps quite sufficiently academic, so I just called it good. But I do actually think it's thrilling, and I hope you'll understand why I think that. But to start with, can I just ask who we are in this room? If you could just raise your hands, and you may want to look around just to see who we are. Who works in an NGO? My goodness, yes. Who is from ACFID? Good Lord! There are more people from ACFID than from NGOs. This would never happen in the UK. Never. That's amazing. I know we're all students, okay, but forgetting that, who are technically students here? It's a lot. Yes, that's great. Who are faculty of universities, ANU and others? Yeah. Why are they sitting right round the edge? Political leaders. Well, politicians who are not leaders. No. Freelance, people who are freelance in one way or another. That's a very important category. There are quite a number. That's really good. Journalists? No. Who are Australians? And who are other nationalities? Wow. That is truly remarkable, and I know we owe a lot to ACFID for having made it possible for people to come from all over Australia, and also to come to Australia. So congratulations on that. That's another thing that we would never be able to achieve in the UK in a similar meeting, I'm afraid. Who are paper writers for the conference? It's a lot, isn't it? There are 82 papers. That's great. Now, about myself and today, before I read the abstracts of the papers, I thought I'd be going around saying one of the problems in our world is all these old men who are out of touch and out of date. Rather priding myself and stroking myself, well, I may be an old man, but I'm not out of touch, I'm not out of date. But when I read the abstracts, I realized that there's been a huge amount of innovation, and I've got to run like anything and read like anything and listen like anything in order to catch up with where you guys have got to, because it's a very fast-moving field, so thank you for that. The other thing I'd like to say is, I don't know if you're familiar with the ERR. It's not the economic rate of return, it's the egocentric reminiscence ratio. And this is the proportion of a person's speech which is devoted to their memories and their past life. Now, I've already been guilty of that, but there are 5 hypotheses, possibly 6. One is that it's higher among males than females. The second, that it rises with age. The third is that on retirement it leaps to a new high plateau. The fourth is that it's higher in the evening than the morning. And the fifth, that it rises sharply with the consumptions of something stronger than that water over there. So if you meet an old man in a pub in the evening, you know what to expect. But I will reflect a little bit on some things in the past, because I think that we can learn from the past, as well as learning from the present and looking forward. The other thing I'd like to say is that I've often been wrong about things, and I'm not being modest. I'm just being realistic. I've often been wrong, and I may well be wrong about some of the things which I say today. And we all need to use our own best judgment and to be critical. And not to be deferential if we're going to make good progress. Finally, on all this, I can't help it. I'm one of those. Was that me? No. Don't worry. If your phone goes off, don't feel bad, because I shall be feeling really grateful that it's not mine. I believe that if you think of things as being half full, there's a better chance of going on filling them. If you think of them as being half empty, there's a danger that they'll shrink even more. I think a certain amount of sort of quasi-naive optimism can be self-fulfilling. And I guess, I don't know whether I'm naive or not, but I can't help being an optimist, including an optimist as a result of what I've come to learn about this conference. I am not going to cover a lot of the big issues in our world. I'm not going to touch on climate change, tax havens, the Tobin tax, footloose, multinationals, human rights, not really, There'll be a bit on gender relations, but not as much as there should be, perhaps. Fragile states, refugees. There's a whole raft of really, really big problems and issues. I'm not going to touch them, only by implication, in that if some of the things happen that I'm going to suggest would be good to happen, then it might contribute to solving quite a lot of these problems. But what I will do, and it's on the sheet that you've got there, I'll say something about our world today, I'll say something about challenges and opportunities, something about participatory methodologies, and then some ideas about an agenda. The first thing, however, is just to say something about words and meanings. I'm not going to define participation. I don't think it would be particularly useful. It's used to cover a whole range of different activities, good and bad. We know it's a blanket term which covers a multitude of virtues and their opposite. But what I think it's worth including under this when we talk about participation for development is what I think we could generally agree as being behaviors, attitudes, ethics, which are participatory, and research, which is also participatory. And a lot of this is to do with power, it's to do with relationships, it's to do with interactions, and trying to get these right. And it affects not just research, not just working communities. It affects what happens within organizations and how people relate to one another in organizations, particularly around issues of power and control and of enabling people. And it affects family, it affects education and styles of education. It's something, these attitudes and behaviors are something which can be pervasive in our whole world. At least that's the way it seems to me. And then if we think about development, I feel really bad because this has been set as an essay question for students. So I hope I'm not giving any of the faculty around the edge any ideas, but my definition of development is good change. So immediately you have to ask, well, what's good? Who defines good? Whose definition? Whose values? And what changes are significant? And this leads right into a lot of questions around participation, about relationships, about listening, about learning from others, about exchanging ideas, about moving forward together. So when I have this title, Participation for Development, a Good Time to Be Alive, I thank you. That's the sort of ground that I'm trying to cover. Now, if we come to our world today, I've picked out 3 trends which I think are significant. The first one is change accelerating, if you think about your own life. And the accelerating change, for instance, with ICTs, with iPods and iPads and God knows what. The speed with which that is happening, the speed with which we're getting a new vocabulary is very, very dramatic. There may, in many contexts, also be accelerating inequalities, which are really serious. There have been big changes in the words used in development. Deliver. I went to the ACFID website. Aid is delivered. Okay, I can understand that. But is there, if we talk about theories of change, is there a delivery theory of change lurking there? And does this affect not just ACFID, but the whole of the aid community around the world? Because they're all using this word deliver, which was not being used 10 years ago. And then there are the words associated with power: transparency, accountability, empowerment, ownership, participation. These are all words which came up in a workshop in ACFID, and thank you those who were there for your participation 2 days ago. They all came up. They are all words which have come in the last 10 to 15 years, and they are all got major implications for power and relationships. But when I ask people to brainstorm words which have come into development, they'll bring up these words, but the word power doesn't come up, and the word relationship doesn't come up. So we can ask, what's going on? We don't perhaps think through enough what the implications of these words are. The second trend is what I call the capital trap. And I'm thinking particularly about NGOs and about people working in aid agencies, but also people working in governments in countries, not so much countries like Australia, but in countries which are receiving aid of one sort or another. I have the impression that people in aid agencies and in NGOs are more and more trapped in capital cities. And one of the reasons is our over-communication and our sense that we can't run away. I mean, how many of you have put out of office on your machine? Not very many. No. Well, anyway, because you're not out of office. Perhaps most of you, at least the Auss Aid, well, you are, but only for an hour or two, maybe. But we feel that we can't run away, we can't escape. We're trapped in a way that we weren't trapped 10 years ago, because of this expectation that we will answer our emails. And I think this is a bit like heating a pot, with frogs in it. The frogs, it heats slowly. You don't realize what's happened until you realize that you are actually enslaved to the bloody email. So the question is, how do we liberate ourselves from this? Are we drowning? And are people in capital cities isolated? I've come across story about a social development advisor from one nameless, I won't name it, it wasn't Australia, country, who was in that country, a social development advisor, was in the country for 3 years and never left the capital city. The man who wrote the Afghanistan economic plan was not allowed by the UN to leave Kabul. He was not allowed because of some insurance policy. So all he knew about Afghanistan firsthand was Kabul. So do we have a problem, and if so, what should we do about it? And does it actually lead to a lot of error, isolation, not learning, not being in touch, out of touch and out of date? The third trend I'd like to put to you, but you'll make your own mind up about this, is whether there's a tension between a paradigm of things and a paradigm of people. Now, by paradigm, I mean sort of interconnections of concepts and ideas and words, of principles and values, of methods and procedures, of behaviors and of relationships, all linking in with mindsets. And I wonder whether what has happened to us is that we have shifted in development speak, in the way in which we think, in our procedures and all the rest of it, from what was once more a paradigm of people to more a paradigm of things. Now, the paradigm of things is it's engineering. We need engineers. Economics. We need engineers and economists. I'm not knocking them, but it tends to be top-down, standardized. There tend to be best practices. There's planning. There's design. All that. But on the people side, there's much more emergence. There's participation and participatory approaches. There are good practices, but not best practices, because the practices have to be different every time. And this is also, interestingly, a shift from Newtonian to a tension between Newtonian, which is things, and complexity, which is on the people side. And it also corresponds, interestingly, but this is a red herring, with a Newtonian left hemisphere of the brain and a complexity right hemisphere of the brain. And I think that our left hemispheres in aid and generally have got the better of the right hemisphere. And maybe we need to deal with that somehow. Well, let me illustrate this from the Paris Declaration. The Paris Declaration, when was it, 2006, I think, on aid effectiveness was agreed between all the donor nations. So I went through it, and I identified the words which were used most often, and then I made up a sentence with those words which were used most often. I'll read it out to you. To monitor indicators of effective performance from aid, donors and partners need the capacity to manage the mutual harmonization of programs to assess, measure, and report on results. I then went through the Paris Declaration, searching for words that might not be there at all. And then I made up a sentence of the words which don't appear anywhere in the Paris Declaration. I will emphasize them as I come to them. To negotiate and evolve agreements that optimize outcomes for poor, vulnerable, and marginalized people requires compromises and trade-offs based on personal conviction, interactions, and relationships that nurture trust and reflective appreciation of power and conflicts. Those words do not appear anywhere. So you can ask, which hemisphere is dominant? Huh? So if we've got these problems, why is this a good time? I think it's a very good time because whenever anything seems to be going wrong or seems to be challenging, it's an opportunity. And it's actually quite exciting. I mean, this accelerating change and keeping in touch with what's really happening with poor people is brilliantly challenging and can be very good experience. I know those of you at the back can't see it, but this came out of the ACFID workshop about the speed of change. It says, for poor people, are things changing faster, about the same speed, or slower than they were 10 or 15 years ago? And this is the conditions they experience. 23 faster, 15 about the same, none slower. And then, awareness, aspirations, and priorities, slower none, about the same 2, and 41, practically everybody, said these are changing faster than they used to. Now, if this is true, if this is correct, and many groups have come up with the same answer, it means that we have a challenge, a more acute challenge than we had before, of keeping in touch and up to date with a rapidly changing reality for the people we're trying to work with and trying to help. So we can think about that. We can think about the challenge of getting out of the capital city and spending time with emotions. I'll come to that later. We can think in terms of working on these tensions between the things paradigm and the people paradigm, and continually working on it, continually pressing on it. And then there are other issues to work on. The thought that power deceives. Wherever there's an upper-lower power relation, there's liable to be deception. So that's a question of reversing the power relations. And that's a lot to do with behavior. There's the problem that error persists. And here, we need to reward learning. When things go wrong, if you're an upper and you've got lowers and something goes wrong and they say, look, it's gone wrong, I made a mistake or something like that, you don't penalize them, you say, well done, because you shared that and we can all learn something from it. It's turning the negative into a positive. And some of you will know that Engineers Without Borders has a website called Failure, the Failure Report. I wish they wouldn't use the word failure. I think they should call it learning and make it positive. Then there's the problem that greed rules, as I think I put it on that sheet, that we've got a most extraordinary ideology pervading the world at the moment. I mean, it's just amazing, this idea, which seems to underlie neoliberalism, that we're motivated by money and a rather crude reductionist form of self-interest. And what all the bankers do. There's a little verse which I'll just read you one. It's called Bankers of the World Unite. And it was written, incidentally, before the bankers did their latest peccadillos. Well, they're not peccadillos, they're more serious than that. Bankers of the world invite all the fat cats and tycoons to dine. Tell them greed helps the poor, trickling down more and more. When we're all greedy, all will be fine. That seems to be the ideology which is lurking there in an awful lot of what is going on in our world. And this zeitgeist is something that we've got to transform, we've got to fight against. And it's coupled with the idea that growth is the most important thing, which is absolute rubbish. Of course it isn't. Inequality in countries which are better off, inequality is the only thing that is a really reliable indicator of human well-being. We know that. And then there's the challenge of bad practices. Yes, there are masses of bad practices and tremendous challenges in going to scale, particularly with participatory approaches and methods. That's fine, because they're good challenges where we can share experiences and we can learn to do better. But then, on the other hand, that's really dealing with negatives. There's a lot of positive learning, and this links with it, again, with it being a good time. One of the things that I think we've learned in the last 20 years is how significant behaviors and relationships are. In a way, this is a human universal which has always been there. But I think we've learned more, particularly this comes out of the participatory role appraisal tradition. But the idea that if there's an upper-lower relationship, ask them. If you ask the lowers, you find that they can do things, they can do it, that they have capabilities which you might not have realized if you were an upper. And also that it's a win-win because the upper is able to do better, develops better relationships, is happier, there's less stress. And it links with the idea of facilitation, whether we should think much more about professionalism in terms of relationships, in terms of facilitation. If we had enough good facilitators in the world, how transformative would it be in our organizations? Well, going beyond that, there's the revolution in participatory methodologies. And here I think many people in professions and in organizations are not really fully aware of the tremendous changes and the speed of changes that there have been with participatory methodologies. The 1990s were a heyday, if you like. PRA got going then, Reflect got going then. Let me ask, how many of you have heard of PRA? And how many of you have practiced it? It's a lot. How many of you have heard of Reflect? Yeah. That's also remarkable. Reflect is it's a form of adult empowerment and education, which is now in 500 organizations in 50 countries, extremely widespread. And there are others, a whole range of them, which came up then. Appreciative inquiry, heard of. Participatory video, yeah. Participatory poverty assessments. There's quite a lot have not heard of participatory poverty assessments. That's, I think, very significant because that was in the 1990s. They became very, very widespread. There were well over 100 in different parts of the world, and it's kind of died away now. But these used participatory approaches and methods to feed into policy, and they did have really quite a big impact at the time. Participatory GIS, a few. Most significant change, a lot. That's very interesting. Outcome mapping, yeah. Community-led total sanitation, some, yeah. And we could go on because there are also of course, a whole raft of approaches and methods in governance, which I've not dealt with. Participatory budgeting, quite a lot. There are many applications in different parts of the world. How many of you have been involved with participatory approaches with children? That's really quite a lot. Yeah, it's great. And who's heard of Ushahidi? Not very many. Ushahidi represents what we have now, which is a new sort of voluntarism among geeks. Ushahidi was developed in Kenya at the time when there was a lot of violence in 2008 after the election. And it's a way of, as it were, crowdsourcing information. It's now used all over the world in emergencies. It was used in the Haiti emergency, for instance. And people service the information coming and going from the field, sitting at their computers in different parts of the world. It's quite extraordinary. They do it for nothing. They do it because they enjoy it and because it's useful. So I think what we had in the 90s was a number of participatory approaches and methods which were entities. I mean, they were identified. Sometimes they were identified with an individual, appreciative inquiry, for instance, most significant change, and others. But what seems to have happened is that in the 2000s, they've ceased to be identified with an individual or with a particular group. And they've also loosened up so that anybody, and that includes a lot of you who've written papers for this conference, anybody can put bits together and can improvise and can invent. And so I think we're in a very different space now from the space we were in 10 years ago. It's a much more creative area in which, I mean, for instance, if you take appreciative inquiry, if you just have this idea, instead of asking people what their problems are, you ask them what they're proud of. You know, you can use that. You don't have to go through a huge indoctrination with appreciative inquiry. And the same thing with PRA methods. So I think we're fortunate, and this is part of the excitement about where we are, which is not somewhere where we were 20 years ago, certainly. And that is that there's a whole range of these different methods and methodologies, and the boundary between method and methodology is fuzzy. ActionAid had a meeting in Johannesburg a month and a half ago to try to rationalize a bit the methods that they were using. They found that they were using 40 different participatory methods. And that is a reflection on the diversity and the originality and of the range of options which we seem to have now. Now, I'd like to go on to something that I feel really quite passionate about, because there's one set of methodologies, there's one approach which has been grossly neglected, and we've known about it for 20 years. And this is participatory statistics. And on the back of your sheet, there's reference to a book which is going to be published next year about that. So we'll go into this now. Yeah. Now, if you look at this, can you see this from the back? Right at the back, can you see this? Can you read it? Good. If you look at this doesn't work, does it, if I do this? No. If you look at this, you'll see that there's qualitative on the left and quantitative on the right. And the traditional view is that qualitative tends to be social anthropology and so on. Quantitative tends to be questionnaires, economics, and so on. And if there's anything participatory in research or in approaches, it's the northwest quadrant there. It's qualitative. Participatory means qualitative. The northeast quadrant has got huge potential, and we've known about that for 20 years, but it hasn't really caught on. It's a huge opportunity for win-wins, both for people who generate the numbers because it empowers them, and for those who learn from the numbers. And we don't have this. It's not in universities as far as I know. not yet come across it. It's not used by aid agencies. When you tell people about this, they're very excited. They say, yes, that's a great idea, and then nothing happens. And nothing has been happening for 20 years. And I am actually angry about this, because something really, really important is being missed. Next. You can download this. It's expensive in color, but very nice. You can download this. This is on the back of your sheet. This is about the use of PRA methods to generate numbers. Next. Now, what happens with PRA approaches and methods? Many of you will be familiar with this, but there's interactions between people, and very often, if it's on the ground, we even have a thing called the democracy of the ground. Now here, you can see what goes on. There's a synergy between these processes. There's a facilitator who convenes, initiates, facilitates, and then it takes off very often. And the facilitator just watches and listens. And then it goes on. There's a cumulative process. People are cross-checking with one another and trying to get it right. You can see it happening. Who's had this experience of seeing it happening, people trying to get it right? Quite a lot of you have had this experience. And the rigor is in the observation and seeing the process. And you can tell if people are trying to fiddle it, but they very rarely do in my experience. Next. And this is it going on. Now, it's called the democracy of the ground. You see, when people are down on the ground, it's very difficult for one person to dominate. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, it's quite fun to get people down on the ground like this. And I mean, you can't dominate, you know, because you can't. And the stuffy old men don't get down, they stand like this. So it actually reverses power relationships. Women are very good at getting down on the ground. Young men are quite good. And it's amazing what can happen as you observe these processes, as I think a number of you will have done. Yes, next. Now, this is one way of generating numbers. This is from Sri Lanka, but this is about 15 years old. Because we've known this all this time. You can generate numbers. People will make a map, they will show all sorts of detail. Down the left-hand side there, I'm not going to read them, but all sorts of details about the households, and how many of this, how many of that, how many of the other. And people will mark in who's got a toilet, who hasn't. Lots and lots of information and detail. And when this is aggregated next, when it's aggregated, it can come out like this. Now, this is 1991. It's over 20 years ago. This was in 130 villages in Sindhupalchok in Nepal. And this was Action Aid. They wanted to find out about the utilization of services. And this is just as though it's come out of a questionnaire. 35,000 people, and divided up by communities, by male, female, different age groups. And all these things were marked on the maps, on the ground, with the same similar process, which people themselves found very interesting and learned from, and very often it leads to action as well. So it's a win-win for generating numbers next. Here's an example from pastoralists. This is an assessment of different forms of extension of veterinary services. And this is done on the ground, and they score. You can see the scores with little stones on the ground. And there are service providers down the left-hand side, indicators of service provision at the bottom. This is what it comes out with. It looks quite primitive, doesn't it? Next. And this is what it comes out with. And you can see that the column one from the right, community health workers, that they get by far the highest scores for these different criteria of the service, which people themselves had generated. It's their criteria. It's not criteria which have been brought in from outside. Next. This is an interesting one. This is about changes in gender relations. And what happened was that it was 10 years ago and now. And what proportion of an activity was the responsibility, or dominated by, the man and of the woman. And these scores came out of women doing it separately, men doing it separately, and then coming together and having one hell of a debate. And this is the compromise that they came up with. But you can see that if this is correct, there has been a major transformation in gender relations over the 10-year period. So this is the sort of thing that can be done. Things which are qualitative can be quantified. There's this idea that qualitative is all on its own. No, people themselves can bridge between the qualitative and the quantitative because they can estimate things. They could give scores like this. It's a huge potential mix. Now this is a very interesting example. Measuring empowerment, ask them. This is from Bangladesh. What happened there was they had a participatory process with its 500,000 people in a social movement. A participatory process for them to identify their own indicators of empowerment. In fact, these were partly indicators of social change. And when they put all of these together, they came up with 132. And what they do is they meet in groups of about 15 to 20, facilitated by somebody else from another group, not facilitated by an outsider, and they assess how they've been doing, and then they give it a score. I mean, it's a happy face or an unhappy face. And they find this very interesting, but the outside consultants, foreigners, were appalled. They said, don't you realize these are poor people, their time is precious. They can't how can they possibly deal with 132 different indicators? And so when they took this comment back to them, people themselves said, well, what's your problem? I mean, we enjoy it, we find it very useful, it helps us to make decisions about how we're doing and where we're going to go and what we're going to do next. Because they were their indicators and their process. And those numbers can be aggregated, so it's possible to monitor social change through the aggregation of these numbers. Next. Who has heard of immersions? Have you heard of immersions? Immersions are going and staying in a community, staying with a family for a number of days and nights. This is an issue of participatory learning and action, which is on immersions. Who has heard of participatory learning and action? A lot. That's excellent. You can download it, and there's information about it on the back of your sheet. It's the best way of keeping up with very, very rapid changes and new ideas, innovations about ways of doing things, and particularly around particular subjects. And this is just one of them. Now this has been used as a way of keeping in touch and up to date. Next. These are the Bangladesh reality checks. It's very interesting what they do. They have mainly young researchers, and the young researchers go and stay for 4 nights usually, 5 days and 4 nights, with the same family at the same time of year, every year. Next. So they've been doing this since 2007. And next. And then they come together from 15 different parts of Bangladesh. They come together and they pool what they have been finding. And what they have been finding is very, very rapid social change, of which people in Dhaka are not aware. And this affects things like health services, it affects things like education. I could give you details, but I won't because of the time factor. But you can download these. Again, color's lovely, but black and white is okay. You can download them and read them. And the people who are involved in it say they're absolutely staggered at the rate of change. Things like gender relations, particularly between teenagers, have apparently been changing dramatically. People are eating enormous amounts of salt, which they weren't before. There are things like they're sleeping much less than... These changes taking place that they've identified. Now, ACFID Well done, Osaid, because you've used this approach in Indonesia for basic education. And the outcome of that was fascinating. I went to the website and looked at it. And there were things which I think were not understood, or perhaps not known, about basic education and what was happening in Indonesia about this. I mean, one thing that staggered me was that although education is meant to be free, and sometimes school uniforms are free, there is a requirement to have 4 different school uniforms. There's a national, a scout, a sports, and a batik, and sometimes a 5th one, which is a Muslim uniform. Now, these are all big costs. And then they found that the reasons why children are dropping out of school is not because there isn't money for their education on the whole. It's because of peer pressure and because of lifestyle choices. Now, a whole range of things like this where there's very, very good feedback because it's not a power relationship, it's people just staying there and staying with people. So immersions and reality checks seem to be a really good way of just being a person, being a friend, being a family friend, and going back every year, of finding out what's really happening. And now it's going to be spread to Nicaragua, to Uganda, Pakistan, and so on. The last of these examples is time to listen. And this particularly affects those of you who work in NGOs. And those of you who work in OSAID. And it's the whose reality question. I think I dare to show. Can you see the color of this? This book was mentioned earlier, Whose Reality Counts. When this was first published, it came out this color. And 2 people were overheard in a bookshop. And one said to the other, "That's a funny color." And the other said, "Well, yes, it's the color of bullshit." And the first person said, well, not really, not quite, not in my experience. So the other person said, well, perhaps the bull wasn't very well. Unfortunately, the publishers heard the author telling this story to a group like yourselves, so the next time, when they produced a reprint, it came out this color. And all I can say is that the condition of the bull is now terminal. Now, the reason why I'm showing you that is because whose reality counts can be applied at all sorts of different levels where there are power relations. And in aid, there are lots and lots of power relations, as we know. Some of us are aware of it as people who receive money. Some of us are aware of it as people who give money. A lot of power relations. There is this brilliant book coming out, and it'll be out and it'll be on Amazon. Again, the details are there with you, called Time to Listen, by Mary B. Anderson and Dana Brown and somebody else. And what they did was they sat, and teams of people, they went and sat and listened to 6,000 people over 3 years who were part of these aid relationships, people working in NGOs, people in communities, people in donor agencies and so on, but particularly those at the receiving end. In fact, almost entirely those at the receiving end. And what they've come up with are insights and what people have said, which are very, very convincing and persuasive, and I think have got major implications. And I would urge any of you who can get hold of this, and you can download it from Amazon, they say, to get it. There are just 3 things that I'm going to pick out of this. One is, they want aid, people at the receiving end, they want aid to be smarter. They say there is too much aid too fast. Very few people said that they wanted more aid, they just wanted it to be better. Secondly, there was strong criticism of what they called proceduralization, which is the plethora of templates and lists which are now out and which many of us have suffered one way or another if we're in this chain. They say there should be no disbursement schedule. No drawdown schedule. They say that this proceduralization, they close off spontaneous and respectful interaction. And the third thing they said was they wanted people to be present. They said, we don't see them, we don't meet them, we don't know them. We would like them to come and learn from us. And here's a quote. They were very cautious about their generalizations, but here they say this. Every story of effective aid told by aid recipients included a description of particular staff who worked in ways that developed respect and trust with aid recipients. Now that's quite a remarkable statement. In every case there was a person. And that makes one wonder, do we pay enough attention to people, to continuity, to contact, to learning from one another? So there are major implications, I think, for capital traps, for interaction, for continuity, for staff being closer to the ground, probably more staff, and continuous and respectful mutual learning. So now we're very near the end. The 3 R's, and this is an agenda. So what? I mean, what are the sorts of things that we can do apart from those already touched on? Well, first of all, and these are really with question marks to you, are these feasible? Are these practical? Are they right as ideas of what to do? The first is reversals. And this is changing our behavior. Particularly using power to empower others. And the words which came up in the brainstormings which we've been having the last 2 days, words like trust, convene, facilitate, reward honesty, and so on. Let me give you 2 examples. Both of them are from Plan. And they also fit with the things people tension, because the disbursements and counting disbursements belongs on the things side. This is from Bangladesh. The country director, Maccabi, in Bangladesh, had a program of subsidized toilets, paid for by Plan, which wasn't working. They were monuments, or they were dismantled, they were used for other purposes. It simply wasn't working. He had a budget of $60,000. He changed from that top-down, standardized, give people something approach to community-led total sanitation, which people do their own analysis, take their own action. And in that year, over 10 times as many people benefited and actually used their toilets, which they'd constructed themselves, as before. But he only spent $12,000. He only spent a fifth of his budget. So he was in trouble with Woking because he hadn't spent the money. And yet what we need to realize is not spending a budget is sometimes the very best indicator of participation that we can expect. So this is a reversal. It has to be turned on its head. The other one I'd like to give you is from Zimbabwe. This is Elsa Kragholm, who is a wonderful, wonderful woman. She became country director for Plan in Zimbabwe. And when she arrived, she sent a circular to all her staff. And if any of you are country directors or like this is a challenge. Would you dare to do this? I don't know whether, I think probably I now would have to dare to. When she arrived there, she sent a circular to all staff, 150 plus. And she said, send me a list of all the things you want me not to do. And she got this list, over 100. But it established a relationship. And they're brilliant. They've developed, in a collaborative way, they developed codes of ethics. They have a thing called leave on time, which means not arrive on time, but leave on time. They've cut down their accidents enormously. They recently had all the people riding motorcycles, because they had so many crashes, all the people riding motorcycles, they all got together and developed a code of practice. Last year, they didn't have a single motorcycle accident. And Plan Zimbabwe, for 2 consecutive years, has been voted the best managed organization in the whole of Zimbabwe, and that includes the private sector. So this is where you get really strong reversals and really good emphasis on relationships and trust and asking people. This is the sort of thing that can happen. And when we think about reversals, we can think about power with women, with children, wherever there's upper-lower relationships. The same things apply. The second R is reflexivity. And this is reflecting on one's own mindset, one's own frame, one's own language, one's own concepts, and how they affect how we see the world and how we relate to the world. I think universities would do well at the end of every course to have a day spent reflecting on what that course has done to the mindset, to the categories, to the ways in which things are framed. Because we know that we come out with different vocabularies and different concepts, but becoming aware of that could be a very significant contribution. And then the third one is realism, which is being in touch and being up to date. Rewarding people who report on things which have not worked, the failure report I mentioned. Using reality checks, finding ways of keeping in touch. Now, when my mother was 94, she was a very independent woman. She was a feminist, actually, before there was the word feminism, I think. But she was very independent. She lived on her own. So I used to phone her in the evening, and she was a little bit deaf. So I phoned her one day, and she said, "What have you been doing today, Robert?" So to keep it simple, I don't actually believe in teaching. I try to avoid teaching. I think we help one another to learn. But anyway, to keep it simple, I said, "I've been teaching." And she said, "What?" I didn't catch it. I said, "I've been teaching." And she said, "Speak up." "I've been teaching." And she said, "Oh, preaching." And I'm afraid that what I'm saying, what I've said so far, and what I'm now going to say, will sound very much like teaching and preaching. And it's not in that spirit at all. Because, well, I mean, you've probably realized that I'm irreducibly English. I can't help it. I was born that way. As far as I know, I didn't have any choice. But what I do recognize is that the English have got one way in which I think they could reasonably claim to lead the world, although Indians have challenged me on this. It's not cricket. It's not rugby. But we can hold our heads high and say that we lead the world in hypocrisy. So what I'm really saying, yes, not yet. What I'm really saying is that I think that all of this comes back to the personal. And you know Gandhi's famous saying, which is quoted again and again, we must become, I mean, different versions of it, we must become the change we wish to see in the world. But it's in that sort of spirit that it so much depends on what we as individuals actually do. And we have opportunities the whole time. If you think about professional change, if you think about change in organizations, change in procedures, changes in how we hold meetings, all these things, there are lots and lots of little things that we can do which will move things a little bit in a participatory direction. And so one of the things which is said in, the next. from time to listen. There's this sentence which I just picked out. Every moment of business as usual is a lost moment for making change. Now that's one hell of a challenge, and it may not always be true, but I find that really quite a serious thought. So, coming to a conclusion, I'm thinking about this conference that we have now, thinking about the world in general and after the conference. With participation for development, is this really a good time to be alive? Do we have a range of options now which we didn't have before because of all the participatory approaches, methods, our understandings of the importance of power and relationship, which were not really there before, but we do have them much, much more now. Does this make this a very exciting time to be alive? And I wish I was a bit younger and had a bit more time the way you do. But if that is the case, then we are very lucky to be alive at a time like this. And as far as this conference is concerned, yes. Next. Can we make this conference, our conference, these next 2 days, because it's been set up for us beautifully in bringing us all together and in getting the papers with this huge amount of experience which is being shared. Can we make it a good time to be alive, to meet, to share, listen, learn, change, and have a bloody good time?
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes for questions, Robert, after that wonderful, stimulating exposition. And at the beginning I said, I hope we will have fun at this conference, and you said, I hope so, and indeed we are. So, questions for Robert. You might come over and stand here by the mic, if you like.
I've got one here.
Oh, you've got one, okay.
I thought,
Yes.
I thought I'd talked for long enough to exclude questions. But
Could you...
I did try.
Could you please introduce yourself when you ask a question with the gentleman up the top there, and we're bringing a mic to you. We've got roving mics.
Thank you, Professor. You are phenomenal there. I was just wondering, I'm also using part of what you do in my PhD. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Melbourne. I was just wondering, when you see a whole lot of academics, you find some criticism about participatory methods. So I was wondering why you didn't mention a bit of that. Thanks.
Yep, good. That's a very welcome question.
Do you want to take a few,
Well,
Robert?
let's take a few. Yes.
Okay, yes.
Thank you for that.
Gentleman here. Yes.
Thank you, Robert. My name is Robert Howard from the Burlington Institute in Melbourne. And I know there are lots of other people in the room, so this is a question through you to them as well. And to anyone,
Do you want to come up here and speak to me?
anyone in NHMRC in the room by chance? Because I think one of our challenges here is to get this kind of work funded through AusAid, through the National Health and Medical Research Centre. So I wonder what your experience has been, maybe in the MRC in the UK or any other funding bodies, to get participatory research acknowledged. And I think your discussion around quantifying is important as well. But as you acknowledge, there's a series of methodologies that will have sufficient weight and credence. So we could go to AusAid, we can go to the NHMRC, which I tried 5 years ago to little avail. What do we need to do to actually educate them in that sense?
And perhaps one more? Yes, the lady in the green.
Hi, I'm Kath Cole. I'm from AUT University in Auckland. I work in the health sector, in public health, but I also have been in international development for a number of years. And what I'm interested in, perhaps Robert, you could comment on this, is how do we, when we're working in particular sectors and with large organisations or government, how do we embed those kind of participatory ideas, concepts, philosophies into sort of systems and structures which have to have a kind of a legal framework, regulatory framework, and that's what we're constantly challenged by, is bringing those things together.
I think let's go with those.
Shall we go? Go? I'm particularly grateful to the PhD student from Melbourne, because I didn't deal with the whole range of issues about criticism, and you're absolutely right. It's not at all that I think that they should be swept under the table. One of the criticisms is that participation is part of a covert neoliberal agenda. And I mean, it's perfectly understandable that that could be believed, because if there's a lot of participation, it may let the state off the hook. For me, and you may not agree with this, but for me, it's asking the wrong sort of question. The question ought to be, is what is happening better for people or worse for them? And in their own terms. I think that's the question that should be asked. And sometimes less money can mean that things are better. Now, there have been, in my view, some well-founded criticisms of participatory practice. But when you go into the detail, those that come from academics have tended to be criticisms of their own practice, which people in NGOs and elsewhere would not recognize as being good practice. And that may sound a very harsh comment by me, but I can actually substantiate it. The book, The Tyranny, Participation, the New Tyranny, question mark, is really not terribly well informed. And its sequel, I put it on the sheet, its sequel is much better informed. But criticism is always important, and particularly self-criticism and criticism within organizations. So thank you for that question. The issue around participatory research, we haven't got it sussed out in the UK. One of the problems is a dominance, and I think this is part of the right-left hemisphere thing. There seems to be a dominance of the norms of, quotes, rigorous medical research. And the randomized controlled trial is riding high. The randomized controlled trial has got its uses. I'm not against it in any blanket way, but it is extremely expensive. It doesn't always lead to clear results. It postpones learning, and it postpones adapting and changing as a process is going forward. So I think that it's been over-applied, partly because sometimes medical researchers have become very dominant in the hierarchies. What I would urge all of you to do is, when you generate numbers in a participatory way, please write it up, please share it, please disseminate it, get it into participatory learning and action, so that we can build up more and more evidence of the power of this method and the fact that it's a win-win, that people themselves gain from it because they learn. And if they generate numbers, sometimes they can use that for their own advocacy, which can be very, very powerful. And then the last one about, how do you transform systems, administrative and other systems? Bit by bit. I don't think that there's ever any magic wand, but there are points at which you can have quite a big effect. Getting on an appointments board, drawing up a job description, mundane things like that can sometimes make a difference. If you get a different sort of person coming into the organization and you build up allies. Changing procedures, I think, is underestimated as a way of securing change. The one example that I would I would give there is, some of you will have heard of it, ALPS, the Accountability Learning and Planning System, which was introduced over 10 years ago into ActionAid. Now that required that there should be an annual, very participatory process, reviewing the past and looking forward. And introducing requirements, it can be staff retreats, it can be reflection, bringing people together, and particularly bringing them together outside the work environment. I think that can sometimes be very transformative. Thank you.
Okay.